Why is it mankind has great capacity to travel in space, develop very sophisticated tools, and yet we don't seem to be on the same par when it comes to human relations? We still have wars, and deadly wars. We still have animosity. We still have feuds. We still want often to isolate from certain people. We declare some people's personalities overall to be toxic. I think we might look, if we were to use the word in one sense, despot, a word I'm not totally enamored by, because if we step in a puddle of mud or water, mud, what have you, in nature, we don't say it's a despot. It's simply something we don't like, and let's say if you step in a pothole and break your ankle and everything after that going downhill, we still don't call that pothole a despot, and yet it can be quite toxic to us. So at any rate then, language can be a bugaboo in certain respects, my perspective. But still, how come we are not as happy just living life and interacting, but we sure do have much more acumen, what have you, to travel in space, to have come up with the internet, computers, and I'd hate to have to say it or whatever, but, very destructive weapons used in warfare. Whether for good or bad, whether for nefariously impactful offensive measures or for good defense measures, or what have you, just in the rough. So I think, first of all, and I've written an article in Medium magazine on this under some title, it is far harder to understand various aspects of people than it is quote-unquote objects. Now, not everybody is enamored with some of the ideas of Charles Darwin for various reasons. But if we look at what he did in his life, I think we could see that he worked almost exclusively with objects in the sense of non-humans, or shall we say quasi-objects in terms of lower life forms. In other words, it was far easier to collect information on non-humans for a variety of reasons. That's one issue. Therefore, it's far easier to understand a variety of aspects of car mechanics or air conditioning, which are complex things in and of themselves, or even plumbing, or get to the moon, or Mars, or make computers, than it is to quote-unquote understand what we need to understand in its complexity regarding people. In other words, people data, people understanding the complexity of people is far harder to achieve than to understand non-human, shall we say, situations at hand, for lack of a better phrase or word. That's one thing, I think. Now, number two is if we do not see the complexities of human interaction and the differences between individuals also or groups, then that also is problematic. For instance, consider Johnny Carson's fourth and final wife. If we look, we can see some of the background that probably gives quite a bit of veracity to claims by some people, maybe a significant number of people, that his fourth and final wife was, by and large, his happiest marriage and the most positively impactful on his life overall. And then we look and we see she was a former stockbroker and came from a what some people would say was a very simpler way of life, just to put it simply, or, in a nutshell. That can be looked into. But note then what it takes to be a stockbroker, plus and minus. I'm not saying, the lifestyle of a stockbroker is optimal in all regards, but I would say you cannot be a stockbroker and be non-cognizant of complexity and how to manage complexity, how to get a handle on it, and the tools involved. Plus or minus as to whether you find that the most advantageous way of living in the long term for yourself and the planet. The requirements to be a good stockbroker are just pretty much cut and dried, I believe, including the tools. And I'm not just saying computers as a tool, say, or data management tools in general, but the intellectual tools, the cognitive tools, including mathematics. And mathematics has been referred to by some, I'm not exactly sure where, as the queen of the sciences. But really, I would just have to say mathematics is a potent catalyst tool, without which a lot of things aren't going to happen to any appreciable degree. Now, from this one book I have in my lap right now, The 3 Secrets of Wise Decision Making by Barry F. Anderson. He was a professor of late here, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Portland State University. And he taught courses on personal decision-making, decision psychology, conflict resolution, and ethical decision-making, and also published in the areas of cognitive psychology and judgment and decision-making, and consulted on personal decisions and public and private policy decisions. That's from the back cover of this book. Now, a couple points here that are interesting, not, complete in and of themselves, I think, but interesting. On preface page 8, this quote from Sir Francis Bacon, 1620, one of Sir Francis Bacon's writings, and, we could look it up here, more details. The unassisted hand and the understanding left to itself possess but little power. Effects are produced by the means of instruments and helps, which the understanding requires no less than the hand. Well, I'm not exactly sure what the hand means or what he meant by that, or maybe it's just a vague concept that even Sir Francis Bacon didn't have clarified, but my perception here is the unassisted hand is the hand without a certain tool in its hand, or shall we say a multiplier, or to some extent, chemically speaking, a catalyst, to take something and move it along much more rapidly. In other words, you could say, if you have a lot of skills but you can't get to work because you can't ride to work, or you can't take a bicycle, or your work isn't in your home or your backyard workshop, or you can't do it on the internet, well, you're kind of like a, what is the phrase? You're kind of hampered. You need a catalyst. You need a certain tool to multiply what you already have on hand. Otherwise, your talents, your skills, your character, or whatever, and more. And hence, often for many people these days, your catalyst tool would be a car. And of course, all that goes into that plus and minus, or by way of obviating some of that by working at home, what have you. But for some period of time, it was a car as a tool or catalyst, therefore, for what otherwise would be a set of talents, plus and minus a course overall, that would be rather dead in the water. I know this from personal experience from somebody I knew for many years who was very talented in the medical arena and very gifted emotionally overall and character-wise, But this individual just could not get their hands on a car. They couldn't afford one, what have you. And, various parameters going into that, why they didn't have a car for an extended period of time. So they had all these aspects that were very valuable, but they didn't have a catalyst aspect to move it along. The unassisted hand. You might say they didn't have in their hand the car keys to do something far better, especially in a competitive environment. And so the person was repeatedly turned down for work in the medical arena only because they didn't have a car. And alternative forms of transportation were perceived by the companies as too cumbersome to render service compared to other people walking in the door, with, ironically, less than stellar qualifications in other respects. Now, on the same page here of the book, The 3 Secrets of Wise Decision Making by Barry F. Anderson, Roman numeral 8 here, preface page. If we take the concept of cultural evolution seriously, we might look for the disappearance of decision analysts. Now, when we say decision analysts, I think we're also saying mathematicians to a degree, or how do you best handle complexity moreover. And not only complexity, but it would be nice also to know how best to address your skills in complexity. And so to go on here, there is a precedent. At one time, professional scribes wrote for those who could not. Well, what is a scribe? A scribe is simply maybe somebody who can do something mechanically, or shall we say assembly line fashion, or follow an algorithm. It's not necessarily being able to do something unusual out of the box, but rather to follow a procedure. So, to repeat, at one time professional scribes wrote for those who could not. Later, professional arithmeticians, if I'm pronouncing that right, served the needs of merchants deficient in arithmetical skills. Both professions have disappeared. Well, what does that mean to use arithmetics for merchants and to be deficient in arithmetic skills? Again, maybe arithmetics is by and large only what at West Point, when I went there, is a set of plug and chug procedures. Or in other words, it's an assembly line, and you simply do procedures and here comes the output. But you don't know anything more than procedures, or shall we say standard operating procedures, or follow the rules. Now that'll get you someplace, but not optimal places. In other words, what can you come up with other than just taking something off the shelf that has a set of procedures by which you follow it, like a robot? Next, page 9. Or okay, now actually that's page 1 here of the chapter 1. Decisions, decisions, decisions. All decisions, it says here at the top of the page, involve alternatives and values, and all decision processes involve problem structuring and evaluation. Yet there are many kinds of decisions. Most are easy, but many are both hard and important to get right. I'll skip a sentence or two here and go on in this paragraph quote as follows. Decisions become hard when there are many values to think about at once and trade-offs have to be made, or when there are many possible futures to think about at once and uncertainty has to be weighed. Tools are available for problem structuring and evaluation that address both kinds of difficulty. Ah, yes, I just have to say, oh, wonderful, and repeat this sentence for myself and whatever, whoever is tuned in, so to speak. And just as an iterative tool for my own understanding. Tools are available for problem structuring and evaluation that address both kinds of difficulty. Well, we might just say difficulty in general or complex matters at hand. Well, where are we supposed to get this kind of grasp on complexity without the tool of mathematics? I just have to wonder if there are any other tools available, really, than mathematics. And by mathematics, I don't mean plug and chug mathematics or follow the algorithm already there. In other words, what's the rule book say? Or, what do you do on the assembly line? But something further. And I think mathematics can provide what nothing else can in this regard. But then, of course, the next question is, so what if you have complexity tools? What are they going to be used for? Are they going to be used, for instance, to, I just have to joke here, scientifically engineer a better bud of marijuana? So to speak, if I have all the lingo right and more. Do we really need as top priority in the world to make something so fascinatingly profound in terms of potency and more in the area of marijuana? This is kind of just joking here and taking it to the nth degree. Does that really help us with human relations? Does that stop wars? Does that, make us understand the concept of love and iterate the concept of love in clarity fashion and get along with each other better? Well, it might help in a sort of, side manner, but it's not the ultimate answer. I think we need cognitive answers better than a better bud of marijuana answer overall. Probably. Marijuana doesn't really solve cognitive misperceptions, and it doesn't help us frame what's most important and what's not. Mathematics theoretically does. But mathematics can also be used, to invent a better bud of marijuana, if I have the phraseology right. So what I start to look at then is, what are these potent tools being used for? The phrase being, Madison Avenue and all this, and, things are as they are, first of all. So I'd like to bring up a couple things that have been very potent for me in terms of my mathematical background and electrical engineering background and more, and Eastern European background too. The first, I think, is that everything has a cause, and that nothing comes out of nothing, such that this is like a key operating axiom in life. Of course, obviating whatever issues are involved in quantum mechanics that says there's a certain amount of uncertainty. I've talked about that before, that my rough operating principle is that I just don't know much about quantum mechanics, considering what some have studied and put far, far eons more effort into than me. I'm just a novice, step 1 versus step 1,000 in that area. But I think I do know this. I'm not going to question whether or not to get out of bed in the morning to do something on the basis of whether I can be certain of the effects of cause and effect. If I don't get out of bed, am I going to sit there forever in bed wondering, based on quantum mechanics, whether I should get out of bed or not? I just take a practical cause and effect viewpoint. Like Einstein. I think Einstein may even have seen some value in quantum mechanics, but he still probably did not think that was germane to daily living. He probably felt that's something nice, but, not the first things to address. He had other things to address, including sometimes certain aspects of human relations. Although whether it was more toward his benefit versus mankind, I'd have to wonder, of course, completely. But still, he added greatly, I think, to human relations in some respects. So I think mathematics probably can give us the best handle on complexity. But that doesn't necessarily mean all that it, is cracked up to be, I think. And this is then where I would say axiom number 2 that has meant so much to me comes into play. And if I had to say then, fascinating, potent axiom number 1 being everything is tied to other things and that nothing comes out of nothing, on a daily living basis, an operational basis. Because that's all the best I can do given my time at hand and more in life. So if we would say Sam Harris's ideas of puppet and strings and causality, in the rough, is a very potent thing, then I think, we would say, well, so-and-so has done something to me, or I've experienced something. My first thought would be, anger. How come they couldn't have done otherwise, or why, or blame. And then comes kicking in axiom number 1. I don't understand everything as to how it worked, or did work, or impacted me, but I know that there's more to the story because of cause and effect aspects, that it didn't come out of nowhere. And so then you can spend time later inking in the details to the extent you have the capacity in various areas. And that can be helpful to not thus go on a bender, but to say, well, there's more to the story. I may not have the resources overall, if ever, to get to the nth degree of what the story is, but I know there is more to the story and therefore back off. Or shall we say, put it on the middle burner or the back burner as far as blame and more, or even reactivity in terms of hate, comes to be. In other words, Sam Harris's puppet with strings, in the rough at least, is, I think, axiom number 1 for me in terms of, if something negatively impacts me, there's probably more to the story than meets the eye. And you may not have the time and other resources ever, or freedom from certain constraints, but that can be very helpful to, shall we say, not jump to conclusions, not oversimplify. And that can be helpful emotionally too, to yourself and others. Now here is something, part 2, that I think has been very helpful to me and that I got as a phrase in one or more videos that came, over the internet, in this case from Ajahn Brahm, a Buddhist monk from Australia. And if we look in his background, we would see he studied theoretical physics at Cambridge University, and note thus, to be a physicist is to be able to handle complexity above average, by far, in physics and or the mathematics that goes into it too. But there's other areas too that are very heavily dependent on mathematics or, statistics, and whether we're going to talk differences in what is plus and minus of mathematics versus statistics versus physics versus business courses versus being a stockbroker, and so on and so forth. We're all talking, in one sense, the issue of complexity handling. But then, part 2. Ajahn Brahm, and I only heard it from Ajahn Brahm, who was a theoretical physicist by schooling at Cambridge University, regarded by many as having produced some of the top physicists ever, including Stephen Hawking, at least, at some certain point in time. And then he spent 1 year teaching in high school physics and moved on to approximately 9 or 10 years in northeastern Thailand, developing various aspects of his philosophy in Buddhism and his, shall we say, personal strengths and insights and more in northeastern Thailand for 9 or 10 years, and then he went to Australia. I believe it was in 1983. So at any rate then, this was not your average dude, so to speak, in terms of, shall we say, an outlook on life. So he took his theoretical physics tools for complexity and applied them to the psyche, not just Buddhism as per a religion, but the psyche, mankind. And in a manner then exemplified, I think, in this sentence, and if I could track it down, it would mean a little bit to me, but it has always stuck in my mind. And we have to take it then in the rough, not literally in all respects. When I say the following phrase that he used, almost word for word, I think I'm going to cite right now, and it's stuck in my craw, so to speak, or a crevice of my mind, and I've thought of it for years in its various nuances. Again, the words in and of themselves, not to be taken in common parlance in every respect. And here's the phrase. And I may have one part first and one part second when he said the first and the second, alternatively. Rich people have rich people problems, and poor people have poor people problems. Now, I just have to say that again, and, a cautionary note then as to the phrases rich, poor, and any connotations that go plus and minus, and assumptions overall. Rich people have rich people problems, and poor people have poor people problems. Now, in an ancillary fashion then, a fascinating book by a photographer, Jacob Riis, who spent, by the way, many years as a carpenter, and he was a very good carpenter, coming from Denmark and then to America, How the Other Half Lives. And he did work in the area of life in New York City and housing, and what they called tenement housing for certain individuals with certain aspects to their lives. But we could alternatively say that this is the same aspect we're talking about. In other words, one group and another group, not necessarily, though, restricted to just two groups, such as was implied in How the Other Half Lives. For if we look at structuring of, quote, social classes, I think we could come to another conclusion, that there's not just two classes as per, there's not just, quote, the middle class and the working class, or just two groupings. Notice, even thus, groupings requires complexity, hint, mathematics, or some equivalent tangential areas to even conceptualize classes or groups in this concept of people. So I think in the rough, that is an approximation for simplification purposes to say, but very telling, rich people have rich people problems, and poor people have poor people problems. Now, I think if you break that down, to my mind, when we say, well, what does that mean, problems? And why can't we then get beyond the problems? Similarly, from psychology, I take that back, the word we, because I'm not a, quote, bona fide, shall we say, school-issued psychologist. So you might say then, well, I'm an armchair psychologist. I sat in the classroom, outside of the classroom, typically called a classroom, in an armchair, rather than a wooden bench called a desk, or what have you, a chair, a desk, a metal stool. Yeah, those are not armchairs. So I sat in a different chair than other people did. So mine was an armchair and theirs was a wooden chair. Well, mine was a stuffed chair full of, upholstery. They didn't sit in a stuffed chair. It wasn't an armchair. That's my little joke there of the day. But still, there's even a channel, the Armchair Historian or some such, and there's pretty darn good, concepts involved in some of those videos. The gentleman was not sitting in a chair in a classroom made of certain parameters, wood or something, or styrofoam padding, and jokingly speaking, he was sitting in a different kind of chair. Just jokingly speaking. And the location of the chair also. Out of the box being the classroom, in one sense. Hence the phrase, rich people have rich people problems, poor people have poor people problems, is an approximation like how the other half lives, or rich versus poor, working class versus middle class. And then, of course, what else is there? The rich, the ultra-rich, or maybe even then, as per one movie had been alluding to, the Gettys, a different species. Well, as per a phrase from this one movie, talking about a kidnapping case. But see, then, this is simply to exemplify something regarding groups of people, and not just two in nature. It's just an approximation to say working class versus not. Or, rich versus poor. Or even then, in a sense, urban versus rural. For there have been disputes and or discussions, shall we say, moreover, discussions over various aspects of urban life versus rural life. But that's also a simplification useful to a degree. But then we could say thus, urban people have urban people problems and rural people have rural people problems in the rough. We could also say then, literate people, in terms of being able to read, have their problems, and the illiterate people have their problems. So that was very illuminating, and it always stuck in my mind, and I've pondered it and put some of what I got from a course way back at University of Kentucky from Dr. Arthur Heinricher, an operations research graduate level course, about 10 people only in the class, and he was just getting started as a professor. He had just been newly minted as a PhD, so to speak, I think from Carnegie Mellon. Not a school to be, sneezed at, as per mathematics and more. I'd have to double check my, knowledge there. Carnegie Mellon, I believe it was, that minted him, so to speak, in mathematics, PhD level. And then within a year of being minted, so to speak, I was one of his students in operations research at graduate level. And that was a very helpful course. And he was kind of like a visiting professor, to the best of my knowledge, phraseology-wise. He moved on from that position very quickly, as per not being in that position very long. So you might say, in an ironic sense, I got to study under him at a very inexpensive level, cost-wise. For if you want to take that same course from somebody like him or him now, if he were teaching it, your tuition cost would be 10 times or 100 times fold more. So I was at the right place at the right time to get a course at the graduate level in operations research from him. And another thing, I put a lot more time into my studies than some of the other students did, perhaps, because I was at the half-time level and I was older than the average student also. And I was not taking it for a career purpose, but just, quote, for fun. If you could possibly imagine, for fun. Although I did have hopes that it would advance a career in electrical engineering, and I did in fact take up an electrical engineering degree, or rather job, in California within about 2 months of that course from him. But still, operations research gave me that course the ability, I think, to see the following concept on top of what Ajahn Brahm said. Rich people have rich people problems and poor people have poor people problems in the rough. For he didn't want to, of course, say, even if he thought it and knew it, a much more complex phrase that would, be hampering to starting off in this whole realm. He was saying, from my operations research knowledge, as limited as it is, but maybe in some respects having some clarity some don't have, just possibly, who've spent more time in the field, that one group can have certain resources and certain constraints, and in fact does. And another group can have other resources and constraints, and probably likely do. Hence, we can't just say, as per the phrase all too often assumed to be true, they were born or have a silver spoon. Quote, in their mouth, but they have, certain resources. The silver spoon, certain resources. Yeah, but what if that silver spoon, when you put it in your mouth repeatedly, gives you canker sores? Or maybe it just looks funny in your mouth. Or maybe that silver spoon is kind of big, and a plastic spoon would be a little smaller and more portable. Maybe the silver spoon weighs a lot, and a little plastic spoon would weigh less, and again, more portable. So, the phrase silver spoon, quote, in their mouth, is a phraseology, I think, for resources that some have, and yet at the same time, the, quote, silver spoon that we assume is the totality of what some group of people have in the rough, or person in general, or in particular, can have downsides. In other words, constraints. For why otherwise then in psychology, and I was getting to that, would there be this concept of personality disorders and or entrenched ways of living or thinking? What is it that's so entrenched? Well, I would have to say then what's entrenched, the phrase entrenched could be otherwise put as certain constraints that are hard to modify. That those are the defining factor in what you would call personality disorders, or in other words, entities being described that are so hard to modify. Dr. David Shapiro, I think, putting it his way as per neurotic styles, or again, entrenched ways of living, or constraints that are hard to change. I bought his book on the University of, San Diego State University way back around the time that I had become and was an engineer, electrical engineer in the San Diego area, and afterward. I had a $30 per year library card at the university there, and I'd also just buy used books. And that was one of the books I bought by Dr. David Shapiro, Neurotic Styles. And it was very helpful in the rough to give me the conceptualization, not just of the word neurosis and styles, and alluded to, by the way, of course, in psychology, for those who have some rudimentary understanding and more, of personalities disorders as a phrase and more and structure. And my perception overall is that disorders that are entrenched, if you were to use the word disorder, or shall we say even dysfunctionalities or non-optimalities, more, maybe nuanced in some respects, overall terms, but maybe not so commonplace in all books, but maybe it's changing. And I don't have the nth degree of knowledge. At any rate, talking about constraints that some have and not all people have. Hence the phrase, too, by the book title by Karen Horney, who did not come through the channels so commonplace statistically in psychoanalysis, the neurotic personality of our time. Now see, she was saying of our time, not all times, but she was saying also, or rather what she didn't say is the neurotic personality of our time does not include all parts of the world, or all parts equally neurotic. So she kind of left that part out, for whatever reasons. Maybe she deemed one part of the world or some other group not exactly as worthwhile or as skilled or knowledgeable or what have you, or as another part. And so she was making a blanket statement that everybody is of one fashion or one mold or one village. I don't have all the parameters at hand. I could get more on hand if I had the time and whatnot. It's not priority to me. But when she said the neurotic personality of our time, well, she was making a qualifier of our time, but she did not state the neurotic personality is more to be found in one group versus another, concerning the word neurotic meaning constraints. Constraints concerning certain axioms incorrect, and all that follows. As per I say, cognitive therapists probably would say, certain schemas incorrect or certain mindsets incorrect, maybe even certain memes incorrect, certain axioms. To the extent those are hard to change for whatever reasons, you could say then they are personality disorders also, as per the difficulty of modifying them. So when Ajahn Brahm said this very telling statement, I think, that I hadn't heard anywhere else, at least put the way it was, that every person and every group has a certain, in my phraseology, a set of resources and a certain set of constraints, and that this is not obvious, but it tends to be skewed as to understanding. When we say rich versus poor, in other words, we think, the riches have all the resources and no constraints, and that the poor have no resources and, and that the constraints are equal to anyone else. Well, then I think that is a lopsided approach, and Ajahn Brahm put it a better way in the rough, at least in my mind, to clarify, to the extent of getting me thinking more, what does that mean, problems, when we say each group or each individual, moreover, has problems. In other words, then the phrase, they grew up with all the resources that I didn't get. They got a better education. They had a very peaceful environment, very stable. They had everything money could buy. Their parents gave them great education, and so on and so forth. But then, could that be all there is to the story? For, again, Ajahn Brahm said, every person, or, in the rough, every group, has problems. Not just problems in resources, but problems with constraints, and the constraints are not the same across the board. In other words, those with the so-called silver spoon also have constraints. We just don't know those constraints. And even those in the groups that may call themselves wealthy, for instance, or rich, or, shall we say, have it made in the shade, don't always understand all the parameters, perhaps, of what is constraining them that is not constraining some other people. But they are facing constraints. There's this phrase, too. I think this came from, I heard it from David Goggins' You Can't Hurt Me book, also an interesting book I have. You can be purchased easily and looked through, or summarized probably from things on YouTube. If walls could talk. What could walls talk about? I think walls could not only talk about things you'd be horrified to hear, how they really feel about me, how they really think about me, what they're really, quote, up to. No, that's not all the totality, I think, of if walls could talk. I think the walls can sometimes be also talking, or reality could be talking as to oh, I'm wealthy in terms of money, or I'm wealthy in terms of this schooling, or I'm wealthy as to where I get to live, or I'm wealthy as per how I'm perceived, but I'm facing certain constraints. And if only the walls could talk, or reality could talk, or I could talk, or he could even get to the bottom of it, of these constraints, you would say, it's not all it's cracked up to be. My life isn't all it's cracked up to be, and I can't put maybe a finger on it. And maybe I don't also, if I could put a finger on it, want to tell you about it. But my life isn't all it's cracked up to be. Why? Because certain people may have certain restraints that are perceived as the totality of, oh, wow, you got it made in the shade. You got that silver spoon. You're rich in all respects. But you're not totally rich in all respects if you have certain constraints hampering you, and also in comparison to some others who don't have those constraints. There's not thus parity or equality in the sense I think that we perceive it to be. And Ajahn Brahm put it quite well in the rough, I think, when he said everybody has problems. Problems in what way? Problems often in terms of constraints that some people, by the way, might not be aware of, and that might be very hard to change. So we see too, even, you may have complexity skills. You may have certain resources at hand, money-wise, tool-wise, land, for instance, cars that function well, great medical care compared to some, or overall, as tools that we call, wealth and so on. You may have certain allies, but that, I think, doesn't necessarily mean wealth in every respect, as per certain constraints otherwise in the mix. And here's what I mean by that. Take the example of Dr. Albert Schweitzer. You could say he was quite wealthy in knowledge in certain respects, very gifted in terms of understanding philosophy from some angles. He did work with Kant and philosophy put forth from the Kant angle, very gifted in music, very gifted in religion, theoretical constructs or whatever too. And yet then, why did some of his family members and people he associated with in Europe to a certain point in time say basically that he was squandering his talents, or thus his resources, in these three areas in particular, to go to Africa and do what he did? Well, I'd have to say it was because he had certain aspects that everyone would say, are of wealth. He had certain silver spoon ethics. Assets. He had certain great things. But was that the totality? I would say he went to Africa because he was not as constrained as some other people were who had these resources. So what was he not constrained by? And yet had certain great dollops, if you will, of resources, intellectually speaking, in a number of areas. I think, for instance, he was probably not very constrained over needing aspects of how he was perceived. Also, he did many things himself as per constructing things. And that can have various parameters at hand involved. Not only just discomfort, but you could get injured. And also, maybe it just doesn't pay much in terms of money. Ajahn Brahm, too, the Buddhist man I'm talking about, he actually did a lot of construction work with buildings as per, monasteries and such, or on the properties. So Ajahn Brahm did considerable construction work. And so too did Albert Schweitzer. Now Albert Schweitzer too would occasionally let people live in his living quarters when they really needed it and he thought that was important overall to whatever his goals were. Now you would say, Some people wouldn't be caught dead having someone else live in their quarters. Maybe they, learn something about you don't want them to learn. Or maybe you would fear being subject to comments that would impact your self-esteem and make you feel ashamed. So to open up your home to someone else, regardless of whom, is not something everybody would do. For instance, during World War II, in England, during the bombings from the Germans, some people were not very happy to be mandated to take children in particular, from London into their homes so that the children could survive better. Now, they were paid a stipend of a sort that was offsetting, but there was some kind of mandate going on that this happened. And, sometimes the mandate was directed towards, or it fell across the board to some extent, not just working class, so to speak, people or whatever group taking in people, children included, but other groups of people. And they were not exactly sometimes totally excited about that. Regardless if they had, quote, a lot of financial wealth. And I outlined a couple of reasons why that might be in terms of the example of Dr. Albert Schweitzer. When you let someone into your home, you don't know what they're going to observe and later speak of about you, and you don't know also what they might say to you that might be very upsetting. You might thus want to pre-screen and keep certain people out, pre-vet the whole situation, or have almost nobody come in your home, except for those you pre-screen and hire. And that also being a way of pre-screening certain people to keep them from otherwise saying what they're going to say otherwise anyway. Like Leo X there, the one Pope. I did an article on that and more, I think, Medium Magazine. So Dr. Albert Schweitzer would bring people into his home. And his home was more of a hut than a home. So he also then didn't need to make statements to individuals based upon the appearance of where he lives. Plus and minus. I just say plus and minus. So you might almost say he lived in a shack, or a hut, or even say a tent, compared to what a lot of people live in today. Yeah, you could almost say Dr. Albert Schweitzer lived in a tent. Now, of course, it could be a nice canvas tent, like if you're on a safari, and it's very functional and regarded not exactly as a tent, but a headquarters and more. But you could almost say Dr. Albert Schweitzer lived in a tent if somebody just stumbled across where he'd lived today and not knowing it was Albert Schweitzer living in there or the equivalent, saying, oh man, whoever lives in there is living in a shack or the equivalent of a tent. But that didn't bother him. It also didn't bother him to, quote, do manual labor and or, get discomforted, physically speaking, but also possibly get injured. For if we look, injuries are a dime a dozen amongst workers who do manual labor. For instance, in the coal fields of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, especially in the past, before certain mechanical machines took over more and more, as scratch the word took over, but were implemented more and more. Injuries were common. Or say when you're in Alaska and maybe you want to make a lot of money quick, you may be on a fishing boat and you may have to work very fast and you may cut some fingers off if certain jobs require, cutting certain fish in a certain way. There's hazards to doing certain, quote, mechanical work. So it wasn't just that Dr. Albert Schweitzer was willing to do work that was discomforting, but you could actually get physically injured. And I gave 2 examples of sub-industries or whatnot where that could be so. Or you just have strains, like being a garbage collector, so to speak, or a sanitation engineer. We could even up that a bit and say, oh, sanitation philosopher. Here's my philosophy on garbage. You don't pick up the garbage, it's going to stink. So I guess I'm a sanitation philosopher. Oh, yes, let's start a new trade and a new way of looking at things. Sanitation philosophers. I say that because my grandfather grew up in or worked in the sanitation industry, aka garbage man in Philadelphia in the ghettos. So let's call him a sanitation philosopher. So if you look, for instance, on YouTube in the ALUX videos, I don't know if it's exactly said ALUX channel on YouTube, ALUX, and you would see then various videos and or maybe some articles too on, the 15 things that the wealthy hate the most, and this and that and this and that. In other words, well, one thing that stuck in my mind is a couple things. The wealthy never know, just as a rough speaking term. In other words, one individual as per, maybe even as a group, an aggregate, and just in the rough then, the word wealthy, never know who their true friends are, versus just wanting their money. In other words, I'll smile at you as long as you feed me some money to smile at you. And I will also be very respectful as long as the money keeps coming. And what have you. And then another aspect. As per somewhere I saw this, it's not necessarily, again, any of this from, quote, ALUX as a group, and whatever that group might be, just the word ALUX. These ideas then aren't just maybe to be ascribed to one group in particular, including ALUX, and whatever the name of that group is in general, in its entirety. But another thing that stuck in my mind is I'm constantly getting ripped off. In other words, I have all this money and I'm constantly getting ripped off. People are constantly figuring out ways to extract my money that I have. Well, I think that probably applies to everybody across the board. But there are other parameters too, then, you might say, that are constraining to a group of people that we might not think to be true or exist. Now, what those are, though, take individual research, I think, because the prevailing idea is, well, if you have these set of resources and it's called richness, there's no downsides. My joke here, number 2 of the day, would be, oh, they have a silver spoon in their mouth. Yeah, but the thing is so heavy to lift it to your mouth, you're getting muscle strain. And also, the thing is so shiny, other people are getting eye glare and have to buy, sunglasses and can't see you properly, and they're having to have cataract surgery because it's ruined some part of their vision. That's my nuancing then of the phrase silver spoon. In other words, there's more to the story than having certain resources alluded to by the silver spoon. And I'm just kind of jokingly analogizing what that could be in kind of a, cute manner here. So silver spoons can have downsides, or even say pewter spoons, compared to say a little, portable spoon you'd use for camping, or say a picnic spoon. For otherwise, why would we have, plastic spoon for picnicking? Or some equivalent in some respect for paper plates, or disposable plateware, or camping gear. We don't take silver spoons and pewterware and whatnot camping, generally speaking, unless there's some functional reasons. There may be better ways of going about certain things. That would be very constraining, hint, hint, to take a, quote, very wealthy, in one sense, silver spoon, including from Grandma's, spoon collection or cutlery collection that she may have highly prized, and take that to go camping. It just isn't optimal in all respects. It is constraining to have that kind of a spoon in certain situations, or maybe even overall. Overall meaning, if the spoon is very heavy, it may be made out of gold, in fact, 24 karat. Not just a silver spoon, it may be a 24 karat gold spoon. But if you can't hardly lift it to your mouth, there goes my Kentucky lingo, if you can't hardly lift it to your mouth. Now see, to speak that way with some individuals is optimal. Well, that's also from the movie or documentary Hillbilly, I think, and the back and forth of all that. But still, a silver spoon or even maybe a 24 karat gold spoon can have downsides. It can be constraining. And I'm just jokingly trying to make an analogy or two as to what those constraints could be. You might even say, given the number of products we buy these days that say, this could cause cancer or you could asphyxiate, that quote, silver spoon or even gold spoon may have been manufactured in a way that a plastic spoon wasn't, that you could get cancer down the line. In other words, I think we could almost say, it's suddenly popping into my mind, that this so-called silver spoon can have a cancerous component to it that a plastic spoon would not. In other words, it can be, at the minimum, constraining in some respect, at a minimum. You could say at a minimum it could retard your progress, or otherwise be hampering. Whether a constraint thus is hampering in nature, or actually pulling you in the negative direction as per carcinogenic, is another question also. Now, some others might say, too, an aspect of quote-unquote wealth is, well, I'll have no privacy ever again. Or maybe, everybody wants to steal literally what I have by, quote, burglary. Or even say kidnapping of a relative or myself for ransom. But those are only some, I think, of the constraining factors that is associated with so-called wealth or resources in certain agreed upon areas. Like, in the rough, it's nice to have extra money than average to get a competitive advantage in certain areas, or to get, in some respects, the top practitioners in a certain medical area, or certain other areas for quality goods and services in some respect. And yes, you can buy, to some extent, more respect delivered to you if you pay money for it. Because the capacity even to be respectful overall is not a given, and it is more of a gift, I would say, than it's a given across the board. And nobody thus would rightly want to give that away for free to everybody if they could make some money also from their capacity to be respectful. So naturally, respect is going to garner money to the extent you have that respect capacity, and maybe you need the money. Maybe even for medical care down the line, or for your loved ones. You never know when you're going to trip and fall. And not only break a leg, but you might bang your head and want Dr. Ben Carson, or the equivalent, if you, quote, even trip and fall. And Ben Carson can't do surgery, or he couldn't do surgery on everyone, so guess who gets priority? Whoever can make the most, shall we say, positive impact to his life. Whether that would be sometimes money, and for whatever reasons, whether it would be maybe, an interesting case, or maybe I just want to help out a certain group, or all of the above. He would not just turn down money sitting in front of him in all cases. Money can speak, sometimes even to Ben Carson. Regardless, and this is in the past, regardless of just say, costs involved to pay the bills and more. Yeah, he may just want the money, or did want the money, sometimes above average in nature, pay-wise, per hour, and so on and so forth, to promote a certain cause, whatever that cause or causes might be. So there are certain things, yes, that a nice dollop of money in the pocket or bank account can be very helpful for. And we can't just say then, according to Reinhold Niebuhr in the Serenity Prayer, learn to accept what you can't change, or shall we say resource-wise also have. And by change, what does he mean also? What you can't change in terms of the constraints, and what you can't change in terms of the resources at hand. A two-part thing then, I think, again, as per also then Reinhold Niebuhr. And by the way, then a minister, but that phrase some say didn't come from him. Maybe he clarified it and reported his own nuancing of it, as per, say, AA also. In other words, try to accept, or moreover, know, what you can't change, in terms of what? Your resources and constraints. But then, of course, it is also helpful to know that maybe we don't know what the resources and constraints are of others and sometimes even of ourselves. For Socrates said, know thyself, and maybe he was also then alluding to know your resource and constraint package. And then some other people have said, well, sometimes it's more important to know who others are than yourself. Well, that depends. For instance, if you're in the Bronx on a Friday night in a dark alley at midnight, it probably doesn't matter too much who you are. You want to know a lot more about who other people are. You also want to know where you are compared to, say, some place on the prairie of Kansas and there's no one around. So sometimes it's very important to know who others are and where they're at as a package deal. And this phrase then in part brought up by an individual who was a writer, when he says, in his opinion, at least in one statement, it's more important to know sometimes who others are than yourself. And he said that as per Gore Vidal. I would say many may not know, by the way, that Gore Vidal spent many, many years overseas in Europe. And that thus there is meaning behind that concept and reality. So you could even say, just coming to my mind now, again, Gore Vidal. Or some would say, oh, he had it so made in the shade, he had so much money, he had so much political clout, he had all these books out. In other words, you could say he was so rich, but he had constraints. Well, what was one constraint? He might have liked to live in America for the totality of his life, but instead he was overseas for, approximately 2 decades. Well, that was a unknown to some people constraint. Why wasn't he in America? Well, maybe because he ruffled a few feathers all too often also, and that was more convenient and operational overall to not be in the milieu of where he was writing about. In other words, he could say things more conveniently and from a certain angle, respectful or not, by the way, from a vantage point not in the country and or various concepts involved and people involved that he was writing and or talking about. So that was maybe a constraint, because he could not be amongst the people to influence them personally rather than through, shall we say, proxy means, and he could not also have his character ascertained plus and minus, the plus points, let's just say, in person by body language. And he could not, quote, collect certain information as per the phrase boots on the ground by being over in Europe. Or was it Italy in particular? There was also the constraining factors of his partnership with a certain man there, and, same-sex partnership and plus and minuses of all that. And all the spin-outs, constraining. So we say, well, the man was wealthy. He had it made in the shade. He had all these silver spoons. Yeah, but they were heavy in terms of the constraints if we look what constrained Gore Vidal. Now we also say, oh, he was very wealthy in being able to tell the truth. He was so honest. But was he honest in all respects? For if he was honest in all respects, why then did he have such an acerbic relationship with his mother, and he didn't see her the last, say, approximately 20 years of her life? He was very bitter toward her. She drank and more and this and that in her life, and he was very bitter. Well, that was constraining, and so we say, well, who said he was, honest to a fault in all respects? For if he was, I don't think that he would have had that kind of a relationship or set of feelings toward his mother. So I don't believe he was honest in all respects. He was constrained by certain things that were causing those things to be so relationship-wise and to live overseas for the period of time he did. It wasn't just, I love Europe and Italy treated me so well, and Italy is such a fascinating place and I love the wine. No, maybe it was if he was in America, he would have had his head cut off, and in short order, or he would have gotten, in some real legal hot water all the quicker. That wasn't just, Italy is so great, or wherever else, and like, the European way of life. He had a lot of constraints. He wasn't, quote, wealthy in all regards, or what wealth he did have that can be beneficial, generally speaking, across the board, had downsides alongside. In other words, rich people have rich people problems. Gore Vidal had certain wealth and certain constraints, aka problems, that he could not get off his back. Hence a long-standing problem, a chronic problem, or quote, problem. And then you see that playing out also then in the debates he would have with, William Buckley. And you would also say, well, he was very witty in terms of being very sharp with you. And you might also say, well, he was an enigma. So, it wasn't all cracked up to be simply to say, well, the guy had it made in the shade. He was so wealthy. He got to live in Italy. He got to live in a mansion. He wanted for nothing. But then we look, when he lost his long-standing friend, partner, however you're going to slice it and dice it, we can look into that more. His life went very downhill very quickly in a number of ways, shapes, and forms. Almost, I would say, to the extent of how some men, when they lose their spouse, the wife, find themselves struggling quite a bit emotionally. And it can work the other way too, but I think it's more so a problem for men than it is for women when they lose their partner in this regard. And I believe that turned out to be so also for Gore Vidal and his relationship there for many years, and that can be looked up as to the details. That things went downhill quite a bit when that went downhill. As a compensator, or what have you, or adjustment mechanism for his constraints overall, things started to unravel. You might say emotionally and physically, psychosomatically, if you will. For I think many of his illnesses that started to compound upon him were psychosomatic in nature, based in part upon what was then missing to make up for certain ways of thinking and more when he lost his partner there. And I hesitate to even say partner. Let's just say emotional resource or cognitive resource that was often at hand. But that sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook. But I like to avoid terms that have connotations that are incomplete at the least, like partner. Because if your favorite food in the refrigerator is your favorite food, we don't just say, well, that's my partner. I'm going to have to wrap this up at some point in time, but I want to go back here to this book again that is fascinating. The 3 Secrets of Wise Decision-Making by Barry F. Anderson. Well, secrets, maybe above average ideas. Is it the totality of things? Well, probably not. But on page 8 anyway, another aspect then discussed of complexity and what was missing in some individuals. Okay, and actually I'm going to back up a page 7. And this quote then at the bottom of the page. For example, pluses and minuses or numbers may seem incapable of representing in any useful way the complex and profound emotions that are often involved in important decisions. And then at the top of page 8, E. Cummings expressed a disdain for numbers eloquently, referring to, and then here's this quote, some one-eyed son of a blank blank who invented an instrument to measure spring with. Well, what does spring mean? And then it says, and Walt Whitman expressed a similar view, though in a more constructive way. And then it says here, you must not know too much, Whitman said here, or be too precise or scientific about birds and trees and flowers and watercraft. A certain free margin and even vagueness, perhaps ignorance, credulity, helps your enjoyment of these things. Now here's the kicker though. And this then being why Walt Whitman was Walt Whitman, plus and minus, including, by the way, why his ideas brushed, or rather impacted some people the more difficult way, to put it lightly. And that in time, his ideas caught on more. Well, why in time? Maybe because after time went on, people didn't actually experience him in the flesh, they experienced him only proxy fashion. But still, here's the phrase then evaluating that comment and phrase by Walt Whitman, by Barry F. Anderson, in contradistinction. That puts a new eye then on the importance of complexity in some regards. As appropriate, he says here, Barry F. Anderson, as Whitman's stance may be for opening oneself up to the richness of life between decisions. What does that mean, between decisions? It's not appropriate for decision-making itself. It's understanding, not enjoyment, that is the mark of sound decision-making, or moreover, maybe just plain old understanding the complexities of things. And I think then Richard Feynman put it in his own way, the physicist, when he said in that analogy to the bird, you know the name of the bird, but do you know how the bird functions in its intricacies? Just like Henry Ford, the car maker. He was very good earlier in life, especially, and probably, especially in earlier life, because he had the time to work on watches and know the intricacies, as per the phrase from the Thornbirds, Ralph, I want to know what makes you tick. I want to know your component parts in their intricacy, nature, or, conglomeration. I want to know how this Rolex watch works, or the equivalent, type of above average watch. We just think, oh, Rolex watch. But in general, I want to know how this watch works rather than just, give me a watch that's nice and looks great on my arm. I want to know a little bit more about it as to how it ticks in its intricacy, rather than just to know, it's a Rolex, and where do I take it for repair and don't drop it, and don't let it sit in the rain, for 10 billion years. So there's a slight difference between also having a Rolls Royce and knowing how to repair a Rolls Royce and knowing where to get the car parts. If you wanted a Rolls Royce. Jason Robards, too. Is that the right name exactly? Robards? I'd have to refresh my memory from Parenthood, the movie. Liked to do repair work and more on cars in the movie. He didn't just say, just have the thing delivered to my garage, and then I'll just say, oh, wow, look at my antique car or whatever, It gave him pleasure to be able to know the nuts and bolts of the car and all that went into it. You might even say he wanted to gain a better understanding of resources and constraint issues as applied to a car. Likewise, the carpentry work for approximately 10 years done by a famous actor in Hollywood regarding carpentry to the stars. He wanted to know more about how things tick, resource and constraint-wise. He wanted to be an operations researcher without having to, just sit in a classroom and learn just, theoretical material. He was becoming an operations research guy in applicable fashion in a certain area, other than just say, quote, in a laboratory setting or classroom setting. And I'm referring to Harrison Ford. But there are others too who've done the same thing, analogously speaking. You might say thus, in a sense, Michael Jordan learned a lot about not watchmaking, but basketball making. He knew what made basketball tick, and the psyche of his competitors tick in many ways, shapes, and forms too. As again, analogously, in the mini-series, The Thornbirds. Ralph, I want to know what makes you tick. Henry Ford wanted to know what made watches tick. As to resources and constraints, not just, oh, I want to know that it ticks, or that it's a watch, or that it's a basketball. Now here's a very telling phrase too, from page 8, again, in this book, The 3 Secrets of Wise Decision Making. While pluses and minuses and numbers are no match for the experiences they represent, hint, hint. As per the book, How the Other Half Lives, or shall we say, how one person lives, and then you can extend it on. How one entity is. In other words, you could even say, how does this watch function as per the watch being analogously tenement housing? How does this watch tick in intricate fashion? Well, you're probably going to have to go there and do first-hand observation and more, and or iteration experiences called maybe experimentation. It's not enough to, quote, just read things in a magazine that's a vague approximation and has certain things incorrect. As to, shall we say, the intricacies of the resources and constraints, again. So this phrase then, from this author, pluses and minuses and numbers are no match for the experiences they represent, including, in this case, by Jacob Riis, the experiences boots on the ground, so to speak, in New York City, in those tenement housing situations, or the housing in general. And then the phrase in sentence completes here with pluses and minuses and numbers, if used properly, can be far superior to other representations. In other words, let's just look at it another way. Jacob Riis, quote, represented information to the rest of the public. And, for posterity in his own mind, for reviewing more and refreshing his memory himself. Did he represent it with words? Did he have to have high skill level with words as symbolic fashion, processing and more? No. Did he have to use mathematics? No. He used the complexity, quote, skills and tools of photography to capture the information. Hence you can say information is power. You can say as per a way of encoding information. And, in one rough fashion, symbolically thus. You can represent reality linguistically, symbolically, mathematically, symbolically, and maybe even thus in the physical fashion as per, can you, quote, capture it as per a photograph? In other words, can you write with a photograph? And then the photograph takes over the complexity fashion necessities, including the complexity skills, if you will, technology and more, and risk-taking capacities that Jacob Riis did have or pursue for whatever reasons, including a strong why, to use magnesium for flash in the dark, which was a new technology and dangerous. You could get easily burned and more. But his why was so strong, he overcame that, but he also did research on magnesium and who was producing these ideas about magnesium, and he had a different angle than some would have. Because he was from Denmark, I believe it was Germany who was coming out with the leading ideas of the day on magnesium and how it could be used for flash photography. So he might have had a different set of situations at hand, or fewer constraints, if you will, to get hold of the ideas or even know where to look concerning magnesium. And all the spinouts then to help him capture, quote unquote, or write with light, or write with photography, write with symbology, not linguistic and not mathematical in nature. In other words, you could say there's at least 3 ways of representing reality in, long-term fashion. Maybe 4 that come to mind. Symbology linguistically, symbology mathematically, symbology as per how it happens to be so from a photograph, and or maybe as per storytelling, whatever that might mean in all its nuances. But again, what is storytelling? Maybe storytelling is, in one part, information that is communicated by, shall we say, a feeling in a rough sense. So you're talking symbolically by way of influencing feelings. But then, of course, as per photography, anybody can speak symbolically with a photograph. What is the purpose of your speaking? What are you speaking about? So if I didn't say it already, then page 8, he's saying it's great to have experiences. Yeah, but to what degree then can you analyze the complexity of those experiences? See, Jacob Riis was not only a photographer and not only had a strong why to be in that situation at hand, the tenement housing. We can look into more as to why that is, the struggles he had in childhood and more in the initial years in America. But he had superior capacity to handle the complexities of taking photographs in the dark that others did not have. In other words, he didn't just experience what it was like there 4 a.m. In tenement housing in the dark, regardless of how he got there. Say, with the police tie-in, he was like a reporter tied to the police who would go, into certain situations. He also had complexity skills as per carpentry work capacity and a good carpenter, and he knew where to get tools that would handle the complexities needed above average to do work in the dark. And this author then in the book goes on to say here that there can be thus better ways than to have representations of these experiences as vehicles for certain phases in a high-quality decision process. And then he says, and it is high-quality decisions that are likely to leave us the most free to enjoy birds, trees, flowers, and watercraft. And then here is why I think also Johnny Carson's 4th wife had been said by him and some others to be the most satisfying, the most helpful, or maybe also the less pain in the neck, who knows? And, I'd have to refresh my memory more on certain details, and of course, who has all the details and understanding to the nth degree and can represent it, but still, here's another phrase then and or paragraph from this book by Barry F. Anderson that I think is very telling if you were to nuance it into an understanding of Johnny Carson's 4th wife. Another objection to decision analysis is that it places too much weight on quantifiable aspects of decision problems. Now he says, though, this objection reveals an incomplete understanding of decision analysis, or maybe just moreover, understanding of resources and constraints too, and the downsides of not understanding them properly. And my viewpoint is the downsides of not understanding resources and constraints is that certain goals are not going to get met in your life. And according to Dollard and his 39 frustration aggression hypothesis, you're going to feel tweaked. Whether you want to call it tweaking as per anger, hate, aggression on the inward level, not manifested always on the outward level, ticked off, wounded emotionally, insulted, and you can't handle it, can't take the heat. Well, I think then it's the better understanding and the complexities of the resources and constraints involved that would get you over the hump or get you in a better direction or be more advantageous overall. So Johnny Carson's fourth wife, being a stockbroker and all that went into it, enabled her with a set of tools to understand what made him tick. And when she understood what made him tick, she not only was able to not say things that would make him tick or purr non-optimally, in other words, tick him off, be insulting, push him beyond what he could do, but also not form expectations or goals that would be non-optimal and result then in her in feeling frustration. And then, of course, that's not exactly always optimal, is it? If you're frustrated or, quote, angry because you stub your toe, that's one thing. But if you're frustrated or angry, so to speak, because you misapprehend some aspect of resources and constraints and set a goal and it doesn't get met, well, that's a different story. I think Dollard and his associates were pointing out, to the best of my ability, that there's anger from physiological reasons and there's anger from unmet goal reasons. And the number one reason by far, I think, for unmet goals is a misattribution of resources or constraints. And Johnny Carson's wife was far above average to the former three spouses, I think, to the best of my knowledge, in estimating Johnny Carson's resources and constraints as a package deal, and that had benefits all around. And because of her background before she met him, and this can be looked up with varying degrees of veracity, but overall my perception was she did not marry him, quote, for his money or fame. And he did not marry her because she was going to look good on his arm or add to his career in some way, shape, and form. So it was symbiotic in that realm. She was a stockbroker in a sense, but it was not, at least at this point in time, to, shall we say, pile up, certain numbers of resources or certain amount of fame or whatnot, although it probably felt good to be associated with Johnny Carson. But, on the whole, she was applying her brain power in a, shall we say, less than statistically common fashion, just like Albert Schweitzer did when he went to Africa. That leads me then to another common or an uncommon idea. Wealth is not only what resources you have, but wealth is also what doesn't constrain you. And thus again, if the so-called wealthy person, whatever that phrase means, plus and minus, and the misconceptions involved, if we only think wealth is resources and that there's no constraining factors, well then we have that somewhat wrong again. For wealth is probably in the true sense a combo of resources that actually are resources as to what you can generally get and otherwise you can't get, statistically speaking, when the rubber meets the road, especially under certain conditions of scarce resources in certain areas. Top quality medical care technically, and the ability to stay on task, the ability to be respectful, a certain parameter of character, that doesn't grow on trees. That doesn't come, say, just by reading a set of parameters on how to do things. And therefore, these are areas in which you would call, scarce resources. Hence, sometimes you can buy those, on average, if you have certain amounts of money, rather than not. But that's only sometimes. But this phrase then, from the book again, one of the great strengths of decision analysis that we'll see is its ability to quantify what's commonly considered unquantifiable and thus put it on an even playing field with the quantifiable. Decision analysis is the champion of the unquantifiable. Oh, yeah, and I'll refresh my memory again, and our memory, to the extent I have, anything appreciably above average to offer. Decision analysis, or maybe just say also, understanding the complexities involved, is the champion of the unquantifiable. Which gets down again to why is it easier to understand various aspects of, quote, non-humans versus humans. Sometimes part of the aspects involved in humans, I would say, is that various things are very fleeting to observe, or if you wanted to thus catch it on camera, that might be a bugaboo issue in certain respects. And of course there's privacy rights, or maybe if you want to learn more about people, you have to pay them money to be in a certain study, and maybe you're not going to get all the accurate data you want for various reasons. So, the fleeting nature also of certain body communications, what's the word? Body language, often can be very fleeting, and so how are you going to develop the vocabulary? And also, if you just say watch people very assiduously all the time, they're not going to like that much. So there's a lot of reasons why, even as per observing the complexity of body language, can lack the terminology as per how to quantify things. And even if you could, who else is going to understand your vocabulary at the initial stages of your better than average quantifiable methods? So, for instance, there's a woman in England, I think it's England, Vanessa Van Edwards or Von Edwards, I'd have to refresh my memory. She is very good, I've perceived, from what videos I've watched of her, on being able to quantify aspects of body language. And of course, we may have heard terms like, oh, they used an eye roll, or such and such, but you can get much more technical than just having your larder of vocabulary for this sometimes unquantifiable, it seems, the word eye roll. But then if you had more vocabulary than that, who would understand your vocabulary any more than mathematicians can often hardly understand each other as per their evolved symbologies and wanting their own symbologies. Even the Scandinavians are noted to an extent for wanting to translate quite a bit of literature from outside of their region of the world into their own symbology, i.e. their own language. And I cannot understand their language, their symbology. So just because we can maybe quantify something that seems to be hard to quantify, doesn't mean the means by which we do it with our vocabulary is a vocabulary that other people would understand or even want to take the time to understand. And if there's no agreed upon vocabulary, that is an issue. You can't just make something quantifiable with a certain set of parameters. Symbology-wise, everybody must know what those symbologies mean. Hence, if a bank statement came to us telling us how much money we have in the bank, but you couldn't read the bank statement because it was in Chinese or some such, well, it has quantified your amount of money in the bank, but you don't understand the symbology by which it was quantified. And that's then part of the problem too, I think, with quantifying the unquantifiable. Whereas a car part can be a complex entity to grasp as per, lots of different types of tires, lots of different types of steering wheels for something or another. But the vocabulary, although evolved, is by and large agreed upon. It's not like you go into a car parts store and you want, a bolt for something on your car, and then the guy says, well, I can't read the part that you need because it's written in Chinese, and I don't read Chinese. And so, round and round we go. I mean, it was analogously to, should we go with metric or should we go non-metric. We wanted a more agreed upon standard, but what goes out the window then if we have an agreed upon standard? What do we lose? So I'm trying to elucidate this concept from Ajahn Brahm. Rich people have rich people problems and poor people have poor people problems, to say that just because we see something and we say, oh, it looks so great, or it is the way it is, does not mean we know the totality of what it actually is in terms of this phrase and concept of resources and constraints. In other words, resources being, riches, wealth, its plus points, the silver spoon aspect, or the, magnificent spoon. The great conditions, the great resources. But what about the downsides? What about the constraints? If we assume there are wealthy, or shall we say, assets at hand, but there are no downsides, then I think that is not an accurate representation of what generally spins out to be so. There's no such thing, thus, probably, as something that has no side effects, alternatively speaking. In other words, even if you drink too much water, you could die. But water is a very essential and plus point thing. In other words, too much of anything can be bad is an analogy, I think, for how something that is good also has constraining factors. And, too much of it is only one constraining factor. There's also other constraining factors other than just too much of anything. It's not just too much of something that can be a problem. It's that something good also has downsides. There's no such thing, so to speak, probably, as something that has no downside or side effects, including what we call wealth. Or, they got it made in the shade. Or the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. Oh, yeah. The grass may be greener on the other side of the fence, and it also may have a lot of toxic components underground. The grass may be green, and underneath is the love canal. The grass may be green, and you have to spend a lot of money watering it and spraying it and mowing it. Oh, but it sure is green. And then we get there and we find out all the downsides. Like, now I got to spray it. Now I got to manicure it. Now I got to pay for all these experts. Kind of like a swimming pool. Oh, man, they got a swimming pool. They got it made in the shade. And then you find out that the pool guy is sleeping with your wife. Or, then you find out, too, that the pool guy hardly shows up whenever you want him reliably. Or that it's hard to get a good pool guy and who will stay with you for a period of time. Every 2 months you got to find another pool guy because he's upped his prices and has moved on to an area where he can make more money per hour. So, a pool necessitates a good pool guy, and all the rest of it. I mean, even as per the phrase, they love to golf. I mean, they got it made in the shade. All they do is play golf on these exclusive golf clubs. Well, and then you find out, they got cancer walking around in the golf course because everybody was spraying the grass to keep it looking pretty with carcinogenic chemicals, and now all the golf players have cancer. Constraints. Yeah, the grass is greener because it has carcinogenic components, downsides, side effects. In other words, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater probably means in part, the baby always comes with the bathwater. The riches always come with the colic for the baby, the screaming, the yelling. In other words, the perfect example of what I'm talking about in movie format is the movie Parenthood. There's no such thing as a child. There's no such thing as a parent that isn't without some grief or thus constraining factors. Hence the phrase, they're married. They're having fun in under the covers. It's not all it's cracked up to be if you find out all the constraining factors involved. But do we know them? Do we know the constraining factors? Do we have the brain power to understand them? Do the people who are constrained know them? Do they want to tell you if they do know them? Can they quantify it? Well, that's a lot of reasons why we don't know the constraining factors of, quote, they got it made in the shade. Yeah, even as per the phrase, they got it made in the shade, take the Arctic regions of Alaska and more. Sometimes it's like 12 hours in the dark. Oh, that's the shade. Well, they got it made in one respect. Cost of living is less, but it's pretty shady in terms of the temperatures and the amount of time it takes for mail delivery and more, and how you have to constantly adjust to the variations in when the sun is up and when not. There's downsides. There's always going to be downsides, surely, to what is otherwise plus points. I think in psychology, too, they call this sometimes splitting. If we split, so to speak, I guess you could say, and say, oh, it's only wealth there, it's only good things, it's only good times, well then, that's problematic. And I think, just if I can ever wrap this up, two examples in movies, plus and minus. What about Bob? And Bob is saying in the movie to one individual, oh, you're so lucky, you get to have a father who's a psychiatrist. It must be wonderful. And then the gal says, no, it's not so wonderful, and goes into a long list of why it's not wonderful to have Dr. Bob as your father. When it was perceived by Bob at the outset, oh, you got it made in the shade, your father's a psychiatrist. Then she goes in to say the daughter of, Dr. Bob, the downsides of being the daughter of Dr. Bob, the daughter of being in a family that is deemed, quote, wealthy or rich or acid in all respects. It's not acid in all respects if there are constraining factors. And the constraining factor were the constraining bugaboo aspects of his personality or what have you. And the other movie that comes to my mind is Prince of Tides with Barbra Streisand and Nick Nolte. And I will always remember several things of that movie. As per movie, why did she want to leave Barbra Streisand, her wealthy husband, so to speak, and go for a, quote, Southern boy, as it was put, with, almost no money in comparison, and shall we say, not the same clout as being perceived in some circles. And Barbra Streisand's husband there at the time, a top violinist and this and that, and having the Stradivarius. Well, who did she want to spend her time with and why? She was very constrained. She was very unhappy with the constraints that went along with the resources of her existing husband. And those constraints were deemed more of a liability to the overall experience of life, quality of life, call it what you will, than the plus points in terms of the resources at hand. Also, he told her at a certain point in the movie and more, some things that no one else would tell her or could tell her, or had the courage to tell her or whatnot. Oh, you got it made in the shade, he said basically to her. And then he told her some things about her life and more that were not so made in the shade. In other words, your life isn't all peaches and cream, and here's what I think about your life really. And then he says, I think you're basically, in my parlance or vocabulary, a very sad person. Well, sad in what way? And what she couldn't do because she was constrained. She had great things. Buy those sandwiches. Pull out the card, make it happen, so to speak. The respect level in a certain way, shape, and form. Certain forms of power, but she was very constrained from having other things. And guess what then? What did she prefer as a package deal? Overall, Nick Nolte. At least as per the movie. Nick Nolte didn't have certain riches, certain assets, but he was not constrained in certain fashions. which you might also say is an alternative form of wealth. Yes, so the book Think and Grow Rich, if we read that book, toward the end, Napoleon Hill says, money is not the only way to assess wealth or happiness or whatever. I forget the exact phraseology. It's in the latter part of the pages, I think, of Think and Grow Rich. Yeah, in other words, assets can be in terms of money and what it can get, but also wealth can be as to what you are not constrained by. And he did not put it that way. And I would also say he was not, to any strong degree, a mathematician, I believe. Nor did he have computers at all, really, to use at that point in time of his life either, to handle complexity that must be mentioned. So when he said, money, just as a rough remembrance of what was in the latter pages of the book, Think and Grow Rich, how are we measuring riches? Well, one aspect was money, and he just flat out said that. As per what it can get you, on the whole, especially when resources are shall we say, scarce, even as per the emotional component of certain resources, services, whatnot, including reliability, respect level, ability to handle, pressure, and more. But I think Napoleon Hill was saying there's another form or metric, if you will, to measure wealth, or a Renaissance experience, as per the phrase, otherwise Renaissance man or woman. In other words, total measure of the package deal, plus and minus, plus benefits, downsides, side effects. In other words, it's not only the resources you can get in the conventional thinking manner, what constraints can you cut? And those aren't necessarily going to be found in the same person or the same package, off the shelf. So wealth can be resources, and wealth can be certain things not constraining you. And what's the Goldilocks zone? A mix of the two in a certain proportion, which is easier than meets the eye to both discuss as to the parameters and get. So these are my thoughts then. I can't say that they've made me the optimally happy person in the world, and that these set of ideas solve any, problems for myself or anyone else, lock, stock, and barrel. It is useful, I think, to look at these things in a more bird's eye view, including the topic of so-called wealth, and the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, or they got it made in the shade, or man, they're so lucky. There's more than meets the eye. If walls could talk, David Goggins' phrase maybe, and more, of the constraints, not just, the secrets held, and what they really think of us, and more, and how some people, quote, really operate in life, well, that's just surface level walls could talk issues. No. Or even say skeletons in a closet, as per if walls could really talk. No. If we really knew, as per the walls could talk issue, of what the constraints are, when all we see is the resources, oh my goodness. But that's difficult. For if the people who are constrained knew all the nuances of what's constraining them, they would no longer be constrained, would they? So, just to say, it's problematic that I'm constrained and I know I'm constrained doesn't mean you're able to solve the issues at hand. And maybe that is because it's too risky to your life and or for a certain period of time self-esteem to get the resources data-wise and more that you need to change these constraints. In other words, it was very risky for the photographer Jacob Riis to get the data necessary photographically and more to understand better than average by far the issues at hand in tenement housing in New York City. Whereas, on the other hand, Michael Jordan learning the capacities of basketball, pain equals gain, yeah, physically speaking, in the gym. Or say weightlifting, Arnold Schwarzenegger too. No pain, no gain. But that wasn't exactly risky to your life or your self-esteem. I mean, if you were pumping iron in the gym and people repeatedly came in there and cussed you out and, just basically ridiculed you and more, you'd switch gyms. Or say if you had to weightlift or play basketball and get better and better at it, and the floor you played on had carcinogenic components, and that was the only way to get the data, well, that'd be a different form of pain. Pain is not just physiological. Pain can be self-esteem, and pain can be even as per it's risky to your life. That form of pain can be a pain in the neck. Hence, different reasons why data isn't acquired that could change your constraints. It's too risky. It doesn't make sense, so it stays the same, the constraints included. Hence, personality disorders also. In a sense, how are you going to change those personality disorders or constraints, if you will, viewpoints, if the data to be acquired is too risky to be acquired to your life? Aldous Huxley, for instance, notable philosopher. He would not have been a notable philosopher if his eyesight had been better. He had real problems, especially in earlier years, or otherwise I think it was he would have become a medical doctor and not, a philosophical doctor, a head doctor. And so it was the constraining factors of his vision. But that doesn't mean we all go out and replicate that and ruin our vision so we can become Aldous Huxley. Why? There's other parameters we don't know that would not make this very replicatable, and we would not thus all become Aldous Huxleys simply by ruining our vision or hampering it for a period of time. Similarly, Ellen White, Seventh-day Adventist figure, and one of the most prolific female writers ever, if you're just going to slap in the word female, but very prolific and many great ideas in a number of fields, and very practical areas too of application. She would not have come up with those ideas had she not been, quote, handicapped and constrained by a fight as a child which disfigured her and probably scared her half to death too. So that shifted her life there, and without that shift, she would not have become Ellen White. We wouldn't have the contributions she has made. Hence, it's not just no pain, no gain, as per, hit the gym, work harder, suffer in that respect. No. There are things that are so painful and so risky, or maybe we just don't know how they would spin out, that we would not engage in those forms of pain and the associated unpredictable spin-outs too, to acquire something we call otherwise no pain, no gain. The pain was predictable as to its outcome and more, pumping iron or playing basketball, versus the pain-gain aspects of being Aldous Huxley and or Ellen White and or even Albert Schweitzer are a different story. For Albert Schweitzer could have gotten some diseases over in Africa and probably did. And also he was a prisoner of war for 6 months. So there's, never always no downsides to acquiring information, but sometimes the downsides can be less, and sometimes the downsides can be more than we imagine. No pain, no gain. Yeah, physiological pain is one thing. In the gym, literally, pumping iron or basketball, pumping basketballs. Pain, gain. Yeah, but it's not self-esteem injury pain. It is not risky to your life pain. In other words, also, at a minimum, the pain is more predictable if it would be there and avoidable. You're not going to go pump iron or play basketball in a gym where there's potholes all over the place in the floor of the gym. You're going to switch gyms or not play at all. The thus pumping iron or pumping balls is in a predictable and safe environment to some respect, even though it's uncomfortable. In fact, the gym may have no air conditioning. It may be in an area of the country and time of the year that the gym is like 90 degrees or above, or the outdoor gym, so to speak. But the downsides are not risky to your life, or appreciably so as per your self-esteem, all things considered. You're probably not going to break your neck, playing basketball or pumping iron in a gym, because there's potholes all over the floor. And there's probably no, gang-related warfare also in the gym. It's discomforting as to your muscles, but it's not like the Bronx Friday night in a dark alley. You're not pumping iron or pumping basketballs in a dark alley Friday night in the Bronx. There's no gang warfare going on while you're pumping iron or pumping basketballs, but it is physiologically discomforting. It'd be a lot more discomforting if people were shooting at you. Which again puts also to a whole new nuance then on why certain people acquire data that's very useful, including changing their resources and constraint package that meets the eye. You got to be literally pinned down or forced into by something that is so risky to something that you'd acquire that data that others would not, or else you're just complete nuts. This then, oh my gosh, 2 hours and 1 minute here, are my set of ideas concerning this whole concept of, shall we say, invisible constraining factors, hidden constraints, that we phrase thus as, in common parlance, they got it made in the shade, or, oh, they're wealthy. And then you find out, well, there's more than meets the eye, but you don't hear the parameters of there's more than meets the eye, or in their totality, or maybe people can't quantify it or explain it. But it's never, you can have your cake and eat it at leisure too. The cake always has a downside to eating the cake. You can never have the perfect cake and eat every last morsel. You may have to eat that great cake in a war zone. You may have to eat that great cake in 90-degree weather when you preferred 70-degree weather. You may have to eat that cake, but where you're eating it is on grass that has been sprayed with toxic components. Or you may be eating that cake in an area where the ozone or whether the air is quite polluted, but you're eating that great cake. There's never all pluses and no minuses. I mean, you just take life here to close, if I ever close this. Even if you had the perfect life, you are going to die one day. And that will mean whatever you know, plus, cannot be communicated to the nth degree to other individuals if you would want to for their benefit because of your limited lifespan. So no matter how much you know and how happy you are overall and what tools you have, one constraint you can't get over is your limited lifespan. So no matter how well you have it made in the shade in terms of knowledge, ability to help people, and in the true sense, you're still constrained by your lifespan. So it's never a perfect situation to have your cake and eat it too. You may have the cake of the perfect life, but you can't eat an unlimited lifespan. And I think I finally reached the end of this thing, as per what I was hoping to put in one package here. Whether anyone lasted to the end, I don't know. Maybe that wasn't the totality of why I do these items, if you will. For more on that, see Jordan Peterson and, interestingly, Garrison Keillor. For why people put out stuff, for just iterative growth reasons and clarity purposes. Hence the phrase, if you want to learn something, teach it to someone else or try and put it into words.